This is Hannibal here from thehannibaltv.com, and today, as a special guest here, we have Irvin Muchnick, who is an author slash journalist. He's authored such books as Chris and Nancy, Benoit, Wrestling Babylon, and Concussions Inc. He's also, I believe, the nephew of legendary St. Louis wrestling promoter Sam Muschnick, who I'm a big fan of. So it's an honor to have you on. How are you doing today?
Very, very good. Thanks for having me, Devin. I really appreciate it. And didn't Sinatra say, "If you can make it on Hannibal TV, you can make it anywhere"?
Well, it's getting that way in the wrestling business, anyways. We are now the most popular wrestling channel in Canada, so I'm happy to introduce you to some fans from Canada that may not have heard about you before. But I think for one of the Benoit books, Stephen Johnson was one of your co-authors. He's actually from my town here, Ottawa, Ontario. How is it working with him?
Oh, good. I haven't actually talked to him in years since that collaboration with Greg Oliver and another co-author whose name escapes me right now. We all just sort of sat in our own corners writing instant essays on different aspects of the Benoit book, and then ECW Press put it together into a kind of quickie book that actually has continued to have traction over the years, because every few years a new generation of wrestling fans comes along and says, what happened basically with Benoit? Not just what does it all mean, but just some of the fundamentals of that awful story. So, yeah, Canada, of course, is fertile ground for talking about wrestling. You all provide a disproportionate, number of wrestlers and talent, and a disproportionate amount of interest, and I think like serious attention to the subject. And the book publisher, ECW Press, is in Toronto. So, and Greg Oliver at Slam Wrestling kindly, lets me put up a essay every once in a while. So I feel like I have a special connection with Canadian wrestling fans.
And more recent fans, I know you got a lot of publicity around the Chris Benoit time and earlier during, I think, the sexual harassment scandals. But recently you were featured on the Snuka dark side of the ring, but for some reason not the Benoit dark side of the ring.
That's right. The Dark Side of the Ring producers flew me to Las Vegas last October for a sit-down interview on the Snuka case, and they said we're gonna have you for Benoit too, and they even started asking me some questions while we were in Las Vegas, and decided that they really weren't prepared to go into that, which I totally understand. There's a production playbook, and they wanted to get one project out of the way and turn to another. But to my disappointment, they never called back, and I followed up with them a couple of months later. It was either December of last year or January of this year, and found out that Benoit was in the can, and they decided to go in a different direction, which is, of course, they're right. But I must say that Chris and Nancy, the true story of the Benoit Murders, Suicide, and Pro Wrestling's Cocktail of Death, a title that's a mouthful, is the book of record about the Benoit case. It's based on my study of the police reports and the other public records of that period. And I had something more to say about the Benoit case, as I usually do with wrestling, than just what happened, who claims this, who counters with that, which is inevitably part of any narrative in the wacky world of pro wrestling. But in this case, it was a grave crime, a double murder suicide that was one of the top 20 crime stories of the year in 2007, according to Time magazine. And I had a little different approach. Long story short, I wasn't in the Benoit episode, which is fine, but I have a lot to say about the Chris Benoit story, as well as the Jimmy Snuka story, which I was a voice in just a week ago on Dark Side of the Ring.
So for the Chris Benoit Dark Side of the Ring, I'm sure you've seen it because I'm sure you were interested due to all your research in the case. It seemed to me that they really took Benoit's friend's side when explaining the case. I'm no expert on the case. You certainly are. What were some of the issues you had with the way they presented the documentary, and did you like it overall?
Well, actually, it's funny, Devin. I haven't seen it yet, and I'm not gonna try to act like I'm petulant because I'm not gonna see it. But I did want to get past Snuka before I watched Benoit, so I wasn't colored by that. And I am gonna watch it and have more to say about the Benoit. I've seen a couple of other person's reviews of the Benoit who noticed that I wasn't in there and questioned why. I appreciate that level of support. I would just say that I was not the only person who was not in the Benoit episode of Dark Side of the Ring. That much I know. Kevin Sullivan wasn't in it. Dave Meltzer, who I'd like to say has forgotten more about the wrestling business than I'll ever know, was not in it. So there are certain choices they made about the kind of story that they wanted to tell in that episode that obviously wasn't Irv Muchnick journalism friendly. So I will be having some comments about that, but I can't. I'm ignorant right now because I haven't seen it yet. I mean, what's really important for the Benoit book is that there was domestic violence with Chris Benoit and Nancy, and that, I mean, not only had they had a separation earlier, and there was a police incident earlier, but I tell the story of when they're living in their new house in Fayette County, Georgia, of Nancy like walking down the road, and her new neighbor comes by in the car and says, "Are you okay?" And she says, "Well, no, not really. She just had a fight." And her friend Holly takes her to a hotel for the night while things cool off. So I'm very familiar with a history of domestic violence in the Chris and Nancy home.
So, what are some of the main keys to the Chris and Nancy case that you feel are often overlooked when we see stories on the case up until this day?
Well, Devin, when I write about wrestling, and you're right, I am the nephew of Sam Muchnick. I did grow up a fan in St. Louis. I have been a fan off and on through my adult life, but I don't approach wrestling stories as a fan. I approach them as an investigative journalist, and if we can get kind of highfalutin about it, is a social critic. I'm fascinated by the pro wrestling phenomenon as a pop culture phenomenon and what it tells us about this moment of American history and this moment of American culture. And I don't. That's actually the big theme of the new introduction, what we're calling the Ultimate Historical Edition, the third edition of the Chris and Nancy book, which is out right now in ebook form only. It'll have a print edition once we get past all this coronavirus stuff down the road. But in my new introduction, I talk about wrestling style affecting every corner of American public life, obviously up to and including the White House. And I've always been fascinated. I mean, in my first book, Wrestling Babylon, the epigraph of the book is from Juvenal, talking with the famous quote about bread and circuses. And I've always thought that the uh, that the wrestling spectacle becoming as big a franchise as it's become in the last 35 or so years, when I started really delving into it, told a story about something about late Empire America. And I'm seeing it come to fruition now, and we all are before our very eyes. I mean, I didn't expect it to be so stark, so apocalyptic, so dystopic. Uh, but here we are in 2020 with Donald Trump in the White House, and not just as a metaphor for pro wrestling, but as someone with business ties to Vince and Linda McMahon, who made the first and largest donation to the fraudulent and self-dealing Donald J. Trump Foundation, essentially a payout for Trump's participation in one of the most successful WrestleManias ever. And of course, the Trump Foundation has been put out of business after being prosecuted by the state of New York. Linda McMahon, after spending $100 million on two unsuccessful United States Senate campaigns in Connecticut, became the administrator of the Small Business Administration in Donald Trump's cabinet. She's now the chair of arguably the most important of Trump's reelection super PACs, political action committees called America First. And to get really super relevant with what's in the news right now, we've all been reading about how Governor DeSantis of Florida declared WWE an essential business so that it can continue taping its television shows in Florida without a live audience, but with a pretty large studio crew that kind of defies what some people would think is the intuitive thing that people should be doing right now during this pandemic. And in so doing, WWE is able to keep from defaulting on its multi-hundred-dollar a year, multi-million-dollar a year contract with Fox Television. So I've rambled quite a bit, but I'll just say that when I approach a wrestling story, I try to look at try to have a wider angle lens. And in the Benoit story, I think the story is not just that one person went postal, and clearly Chris Benoit was a disturbed individual for whatever reason and committed a horrible crime that, really you can't point to any exact parallels anywhere in the sports world, in the entertainment world, or anywhere else. It's a heinous, horrible crime, and we don't know that it was drugs. We don't know if it was steroids. It was other drugs. It was traumatic brain injury. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or as I would like to say, all of the above. That's why I called it the cocktail of death. And once it's happened, what's being done to see that it doesn't happen again? So the backstory of my Chris and Nancy book, after laying out the facts as they were pretty clear as to what happened. Yes, Chris did it. The butler didn't do it. Vince McMahon didn't do it. Kevin Sullivan didn't do it. I mean, once we see clearly that it was a double murder suicide by the husband father in the house, what happened from there? And what happened from there is that with a lot of fancy footwork, the corporation WWE put out two different timelines that confused the public as to what they knew and when they knew it. They clearly put on a Raw tribute show on Monday evening, right after the news, aware, not oblivious to, or unaware of the basic facts of the case, but aware that Chris was the perpetrator, knowing that within 24 hours they were going to disavow him and say they were never going to mention him again, and so on. So that there's that aspect of the story. There's the aspect of the congressional investigations of WWE, which went nowhere because a big theme of pro wrestling is that it's not important. It's either too silly to take seriously, or it's too big to fail. I don't know which one it is, but both of those things happen in combination to keep business as usual, to continue in an industry that I feel has appalling health and safety standards. and is in need of regulation, which it still doesn't have to this day.
No, and for the regulation, some people will say that it doesn't need it because it's predetermined. But if you look at a case like, I know you wrote an article on my case where Abdullah the Butcher, we found out that he had been wrestling for 10 years with hepatitis C bleeding in every match. If there was regulation in wrestling, a situation like that would never have happened. And we've seen with New Jack, there's been some assaults in the ring that have nothing's happened, no consequences due to it being deregulated. And there's all kinds of extremely dangerous hardcore shows that happen all the time. But because it falls under pro wrestling, I guess they get the pass.
Yeah. Well, Devin, your story with Abdullah is like, is like the ultimate sub mortality example of why there needs to be regulation. I mean, there was no death, but there could have been. My analogy is this: there was a number of years ago, there was a movie made called the Twilight Zone, the movie, and there was a horrible accident on the set. Two Vietnamese American children and the lead actor, who's, I'm now having a senior moment and I can't think of his name, but he was a very, very famous actor. There was a shoot in the early morning in a helicopter, and the helicopter blade decapitated these three people and killed them. And there was outrage, and within months, Hollywood had reformed its child labor system and its standards of safety for shooting scenes in action movies, and so something was done. I mean, I don't know if what they did was perfect, but the point is there was an inherent immediate sense that this was a tragedy that had to be rectified with new attention to certain details that nobody had thought about earlier. And Hollywood is fiction, so what's the difference? So pro wrestling somehow is able to fly under the radar of all of these standards, and it's not right. And whether it's worked or shoot has nothing to do with whether it's right.
The Brawl for All was another good example of that. Any other combat sport where you're actually trying to knock out your opponent would have been under regulations, but they were able to slip through with the Brawl for All too, letting guys like Carl Willett, who only can see out of one eye, so you can't even defend certain punches. He was accepted into that, and he's told me himself he would never be able to fight in a boxing match or MMA fight if there was a commission available.
Yeah, right. I mean, one of my very, very first articles about wrestling was for the Washington Monthly in 1988, and it was about the demise of pro wrestling regulation. And it was to some extent a comedy piece because there's a lot of funny stuff in the ways in which pro wrestling and boxing, just because they're sort of both combat sports, even though one is, one can question sometimes whether boxing has worked too, but that's another subject. But in any case, it was pretty comical how state by state you had these athletic commissions. And I know my uncle, when I was a kid many years ago, when Charlie Peon resigned as chair of the Missouri State Athletic Commission, and Charlie Schwenk, I think was the name, Charles Schwenk became the new commissioner. I said, how did that happen, Uncle Sam? And he said, oh, I paid $1,000 to make Charlie Schwenk the chair of the athletic commission. So they were all in the promoters' pockets. But they had things like, there had to be like a judge sitting at ringside who got paid $25 a show. I mean, these were all feather bedding positions that are kind of silly in state government. But when you didn't have any regulation at all, there were no protections for the performers, and there were no protections for the consumers, the fans. And one of the my article in the Washington Monthly talks about like the very early sortie by Vince McMahon in this whole area, which was his lobbying, starting in Pennsylvania and then moving to other states, to get wrestling deregulated on the grounds that it was not a real competition. And it made for a funny front page story in the New York Times, and he got his way for the most part, and wrestling was largely deregulated. By the way, the chief lobbyist for the then World Wrestling Federation in the state of Pennsylvania was Rick Santorum, who was a lawyer under Jerry McDivitt in the law firm then known as Kirkpatrick and Lockhart. He went on, of course, to become a United States senator and a presidential candidate. And I tell a story about how after my Washington Monthly article came out, Rick Santorum called me. He wasn't famous yet, so I didn't know who he was. But he said, yeah, I work for a WWF, and then he thought my article about the deregulation of the WWF in Pennsylvania for the Washington Monthly was absolutely hilarious. He was reading it out loud to me over the phone. I referred to him later, and it got picked up by Huffington Post as asshole central for the way he conducted himself with me in that phone conversation. So anyway, we're off to a great start here. I'm rambling. We're getting into a lot of wide-ranging subject matter here.
So for Benoit, some people claim he was not on steroids at the time of those murders, but he was on testosterone, which I guess people don't classify as steroids anymore. From what I understand, if it's prescribed, they still allow testosterone replacement in WWE. But from your understanding, what was Benoit on as far as testosterone type drugs at the time of these murders?
Okay, first of all, he was juiced to the gills. He had a testosterone to epitestosterone ratio, and it's in the book. I don't remember what it's something like 39-1, or maybe it was 59-1. It's just absolutely off the charts. So he had a therapeutic use exemption from the WWE Wellness Program because supposedly because of his decades of steroid abuse, he couldn't perform in the bedroom with his wife. So this is like the funny rationalization for continuing to do steroids is like if because you've used steroids, you need steroids to continue to have enough hormone, whatever. Anyway, he did have a therapeutic use exemption, and his steroid use was absolutely off the charts. Now, how did that contribute to the double murder suicide? We really don't know. In the kind of lowest common denominator cable news commentary, when it was a sensational story, when it just happened in the summer of 2007, a lot of the cable news people would call it roid rage. And the wrestling community understandably would say, that's not what roid rage is. I mean, roid rage isn't like killing 3 people. It's like a single like explosion of anger. And I think they have a point there. But I would say that we don't know if the very first of the murders, the killing Nancy, was not roid rage either. I mean, that could have been, and then killing Daniel, the son, and then taking his own life could have been a more premeditated, calculated series of actions after there was roid rage. So anyway, I can understand that roid rage is if an explanation, is kind of a cheesy one, and it would only apply to the first of the 3 deaths. Now, having said that, steroids also can cause depression. So even if we're not talking about roid rage here, it's possible that it was a crime caused in part by his steroid use. Now, to the extent that it was drug use, I think the majority, my majority opinion on it is that it's not the steroids, and this is common in wrestling, it's the antidepressants, it's the sleep aids, it's the painkillers, which in tremendous quantities bring on depression and disorientation and mental health issues. So I think it's likelier drugs other than steroids, but I call it once again the cocktail, because it doesn't really matter at the end of the day whether he did what he did because of steroids, because of antidepressants, because of painkillers, or because he had the common cold. They're all just as dead as they would have been otherwise. And then you add that other factor, which is a non pharmaceutical part of the cocktail of death, and that is traumatic brain injury. And once they did study his brain, and he was the one of the very first brains studied by Dr. Bennett Amalu, the pioneer of contemporary CTE research. And it was one of the very worst brains they ever examined. Unbelievably thick, dense accumulations of tau protein from his not only many concussions, but as we get to know more about CTE, it's the accumulation of subconcussive impacts across many years and many decades. So I think that unquestionably that was a factor, and somehow in some mixture, all of these things we were talking about contributed to those awful events in Georgia in June of 2007.
The one thing I don't understand about how bad his CTE was, as they say, is as a wrestler, I've had to memorize matches. I know in WWE, they pretty much plan matches move for move, particularly for TV. Then you have to drive from the airports to the arenas, book hotels, and so forth. And the one thing I don't understand, if his brain was so bad, that he was wrestling pretty much right up to the point that he committed this. So I
Well,
always wondered.
respectfully, I think that's kind of a red herring, because we don't know the exact patterns of symptoms and how they play out in each individual person. I mean, we also see through this period that he was writing the wackiest diary entries, and he had like super religiosity and some kind of he was paranoid. So whether he could function as a wrestler from day to day and still be a CTE victim, I think it's kind of unfair to pit one against the other in evaluating him. I mean, by analogy, I mean there are a lot of alcoholics who can function really well as writers or other job responsibilities, but that doesn't mean they're not alcoholics. And it doesn't mean that something terrible can happen at some point, even though the signposts of it are not crystal clear until they happen.
Now, for the alcohol that was found around the house, yet supposedly the autopsy didn't show he had alcohol in his system, how do you explain that? Any theories?
Not really. I mean, it's just there. I mean, I think my book says there was an empty bottle of Merlot right next to him. So uh, uh, maybe, I'm not really well versed enough in forensic pathology to know like how much he would have had to have imbibed for it to have shown up in an autopsy within a certain period of hours. Maybe that factored into it. So I mean, I don't know whether he was a boozer too or not, but he certainly was an abuser of testosterone and uh, pharmaceutical drugs that were overprescribed by Dr. Phil Aston, who wound up going to prison for his promiscuous scripts for not just Benoit, but a couple of other people who died.
And for Nancy's death, I understand that she was actually tortured a little bit before she passed. Do you have any information on exactly how he killed her?
No, just sticking closely to the text of the police report. She was bound up. Uh, there's no sign of of a struggle in a sense that Chris didn't seem to have any marks on him except for where he strangled himself. So that doesn't mean that there wasn't an altercation, though, or that he didn't, he was a strong professional athlete, and he could have hit her one time and knocked her out, and then then tied her up because he decided he wanted to make it look like a home invasion or something. I mean, it's all theory and speculation at that point. I don't think there's anything tremendously clear about the manner of Nancy's death. It's a little more clear with Daniel, but the only thing that we have, I think, absolute clarity on is that that Chris did it.
And with Daniel, I saw you on a TV news show. I forget who it was, but a fairly famous guy. You were starting to talk about that Chris was injecting Daniel with human growth hormone, but he cut you off so fast. I never actually got to hear what you wanted to
Yeah,
say.
that was a lot of fun. That was my shot with Bill O'Reilly, the O'Reilly Factor on Fox News. So I got to learn how the Fox News system works, and actually a lot of these television news shows where they, unlike what we're doing right now, where we're just talking with each other, the network and cable television news, it's all about making the host, the star, look like he's the smartest guy in the room. So whoever he's interviewing is in an isolation chamber where you don't see the other person, you don't hear anything except through an earpiece. They can cut off your mic at will, and so he looks tough and smart, saying something to you, and then when you try to make your point, you just get cut off. So it was kind of a funny experience. But what happened with I think what O'Reilly was talking about in that period was that there was some question as to whether Daniel had some kind of condition. They were saying Fragile X, which is this very unusual condition that causes autism and slow development and so forth. My book goes into that, and it's not crystal clear whether the answer is true or false that he had Fragile X. But I will say this: Linda McMahon, once that rumor was in the air, went on Good Morning America and stated that it was basically a fact that Daniel was mentally retarded, and that's one of the factors in what happened, because WWE was doing anything they could to deflect from whatever role they might have had in this whole thing. And then a day or so later, Scott Ballard, who was the district attorney down there, walked back his claim that Daniel had Fragile X, and WWE said, okay, well, we accept it. So it probably wasn't the case. And everybody more or less dropped it. I'm in the camp that hasn't completely dropped it in this sense. Daniel was 7 years old and had just completed a pre-K program, which is a program usually for 4 verging on 5-year-olds whose parents can't decide whether, because they're on the border of the deadline for school enrollment, can't figure out whether at the end of that year their child is going to go into kindergarten or into first grade at a regular school after that. So kids in pre-K are 4.5 going on 5, or 5 going on 6, but I've never heard of a 7-year-old in pre-K. So I think something might have been going on there, and I do think Jerry McDivitt, WWE's lawyer, who never really let go of the theory that the schooling and care of the child was some of the tension inside the Benoit home. I actually think McDivitt was right about that to some extent, and it's in there in the story in some way. I try to deal responsibly with it in a chapter in Chris and Nancy, but it's a little bit of a sideshow because whatever was the cause of the tension between Chris and Nancy, and there were other things besides that. Even if that was a factor, there were other things. Whatever caused, you know, the conflict between Chris and Nancy, obviously in a normal home in a normal situation would not resolve in double murder suicide.
Now, for the Snuka situation, from what I understand, it was your investigation into it that actually led to him actually being brought into court for the case and the case being reopened. Could you go into the history of how you became interested into this case and some of the research that you've done in it?
Yeah, sure. Uh, the what gripes me about Dark Side of the Ring is that at a very basic level, at least, I believe, nobody can watch that thing and not come away concluding that Jimmy Snuka is responsible for Nancy Argentino's death. Period. End of paragraph. That's a good thing for a documentary that's largely pitched at a wrestling fan audience. At least they did that. It gripes me though, and some of it is vanity because much too much credit I feel went to the Allentown Morning Call and not enough to my work. So some of it is vanity, but some of it is more than vanity. It's substance because by accepting the Allentown Morning Call spin on what happened, I think Dark Side of the Ring missed what is the real takeaway in the year 2020, which is that Snuka got away with it, and he got away with it because of corruption in the criminal justice system in Lehigh County, Pennsylvania. And most of the players who let him off the hook in 1983 are still there, including the corrupt district attorney, James Martin, who was the assistant district attorney in 1983, a fact that the Allentown Morning Call in its celebrated 2013 so-called cold case package failed to share with their readers. All right, enough of that speech, and to go back to how I got involved in it. In 1992, the Village Voice, the alternative weekly in New York, assigned me to do a big cover story on the scandals in then WWF at the time. And those scandals were the Ring Boy sex abuse, some more on the Dr. George Zahorian steroid trial, which had happened the year earlier in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which isn't that far from Allentown. And they sent me to Allentown, and I did research on a number of things. But the biggest thing I was doing in Allentown wasn't even the central piece of the Village Voice story, but what we call in journalism a sidebar. I was going to do a side story about this town secret of Jimmy Snuka and his girlfriend and the death at the George Washington Motor Lodge in Whitehall, Pennsylvania, right outside Allentown in May of 1983, when Snuka was there with his girlfriend for the WWF television tapings, the syndicated television tapings, which they did there every 3 weeks. And this was at the height of his popularity. So the reason I wound up running into problems with my editors at the Village Voice, which is kind of the story of my career, which is why I'm this shotgun freelancer who now has a website and publishes books off what I investigate as often as I can, but don't have a platform of a major media, newspaper or magazine. Uh, I never was able to get the Village Voice to get off their duffs and publish my big story about WWE, but they had edited and were satisfied with this sidebar on Snuka, which isn't that long. It's over 1,000 words, but it's under 2,000 words. I obviously could have written a voluminously long article, but it was assigned as a sidebar, and so it's very succinct. And so I go to Allentown in 1992, and the first person I saw was the coroner, Wayne Snyder. He had been the deputy coroner in 1983. I walked into his office. I introduced myself. I said, I'm doing something about a wrestler. And he immediately lit up. He said, oh, you're writing about that Superfly guy. Started waving his arms around. And he says, I've always wanted to get that guy. And he said, write this down. Here's what I'll say. Upon viewing the body and consulting with the forensic pathologist, I immediately suspected foul play and so notified the district attorney. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that's in my article that didn't get published by the Village Voice. I published it myself later in the 1990s at a website I had, compiling all of my magazine articles, published and unpublished. And then it became a chapter of my 2007 book, Wrestling Babylon. If you look at that, what the coroner said to me on the record, I immediately suspected foul play and so notified the district attorney. And it was because he had viewed the body and talked to the forensic pathologist. It is a roadmap to any investigation that was ever done subsequent to that. So I give all the credit to the two Allentown Morning Call reporters who in 2013, at the 30th anniversary, had the enterprise to go into the archives of the Federal District Court in Philadelphia, where they had the records of the Argentino family's civil lawsuit against Snuka. And they dug out some records that the cops were withholding for many, many years, and they published them, and they published a story off it. Good on them for that. But there was nothing fundamental about the story that was not known in 1983 by the Morning Call, and certainly was not known by them after 1992 when I was in Allentown. So I saw the coroner. I saw Detective Gerald Procanon of the Whitehall Township Police, who told me a ridiculous stream of lies. Ridiculous not just because they were lies, but because they were so easy to disprove within hours, within minutes. He said Snuka had told only one story, that Nancy had fallen when they stopped by the side of the road driving into town for her to go to the bathroom. And she had slipped and hit her head, and they thought nothing of it. And later he realized she was stricken, and it was too late. She was dead. Procanon said that was the only story that he told. He told, depending on how you count, between 4.5 and 6 different versions of what happened. He told the chaplain and the orderlies and the nurses at the hospital different things about physicality, either horseplay that got out of hand or a lover's quarrel. And Procanon also said to me in 1992 that the Argentino family was not dissatisfied with their investigation. He never heard from them at all, except for a perfunctory communications over settling some expenses related to the funeral bill. And I then talked to the Argentino family and found out that that was a complete lie. In fact, the Argentino family had commissioned 2 different private investigations. I write about this in the original article, and I write about it in greater depth in the 2013 ebook that I did with Louise and Lorraine, Nancy's sister, which is called Justice Denied, the untold story of Nancy Argentino's death in Jimmy Superfly Snuka's motel room. Louise and Lorraine told me that about these private investigations. They sent me the documentation of it. But also they told me that in 1985, the family sued Snuka in federal district court in Philadelphia in a civil case for wrongful death. Snuka never showed up. The family won a $500,000 default judgment, of which Snuka never paid a dime. He claimed bankruptcy. He didn't pay his lawyers, who withdrew from the case. So for Detective Procanon to have told me what he told me, knowing that I would immediately disprove what he said, was extremely arrogant or stupid or something. I don't know. So that's another thing that happened in Allentown in 92. Yet another thing that happened in Allentown in 92 is that I met with a group of reporters and editors from the Allentown Morning Call. We met in a conference room. We were talking at one point about partnering up on the story with the Village Voice, maybe. They decided that they didn't want to do that. But the point is, I told them about my research, and I vividly remember that the reporter who did the first day's story for the Morning Call in 1983, a reporter named Tim Blanger, said that Detective Procanon, the day he was reporting it, had speculatively reenacted what the police thought was the prevailing theory of what had happened, which was Jimmy grabbing Nancy by the shoulders and probably pushing her against the wall, maybe more forcefully than he intended. And she hit her head on the wall or on a blunt object. And that's what probably happened. And it aligns with the story that Louise, Nancy's sister, told me about a time in the family house in Brooklyn when Snuka was there, and she was alone in the room. She, Louise, was alone in the room with Snuka. And he did something fairly similar where he put his hand around her throat and forced her up against the wall and whispered to her, "You know, I could choke you and no one would ever know," just to terrorize the hell out of her. And Louise said that she talked to other former partners of Snuka's and subsequent partners, and he had a thing about pushing women up against the wall. So again, the point of all what I'm saying here is that in 92, I didn't have all the details, didn't have all the I's dotted, all the T's crossed, but we certainly knew enough to know that there's this serious problem with the amount of circumstantial evidence that was gathered at the very time of the incident, and knowledge of Snuka's contradictory, kaleidoscopic accounts of what happened, enough to say, why wasn't this guy hauled before a jury of his peers and tried for third-degree murder and manslaughter? And that was the story then. It was the story later, and it's the story now that I believe the Morning Call still hasn't told, and that the dark side of the ring still hasn't completely told in the round by having this orientation of saying Jimmy Snuka, the complicated legacy of a superstar. He entertained the masses by jumping off steel cages, and on the side he had this little problem. He probably murdered a 23-year-old woman. Well, that's not what that doesn't satisfy me in the year 2020. What we need to be talking about is what happened with these prosecutors, what happened to the corrupt criminal justice system in Lehigh County, Pennsylvania.
And for the civil lawsuit that he never paid, similar to the one I have with Abdullah the Butcher that he's been running away from paying, what I don't understand is he went on to have about a 3 or 4 year career with WWE from I think around 89 to 93. Why didn't they try and collect at that point? Because he was in 2 WrestleManias. He would have been making some pretty good cash in those years.
Yeah, it makes no sense how he was able to slip away. I think the Argentino family, and it is a working class family in Brooklyn. They probably, I mean, I don't know if their lawyer walked away because he was handling the case on a contingency, and he expected to get some money on the back end, and maybe he didn't advise them well enough, or they got demoralized and they gave up. I don't know exactly what happened, but yeah, how does this guy not pay a dime? Not only not pay $500,000, but not pay anything from then until the day he died. It's bizarre.
Because he was headlining shows against the Honky Tonk Man too on the house show Loop, so he would have probably been making some of those years in the hundreds of thousands. I could only imagine because those were still the peak years of WWE.
Yeah. Well, he was a mess, and his finances were a mess. He had back taxes. He had a lot of stuff going on. So I'm no expert on accounting and who's senior debtor and how you get away with not paying a $500,000 judgment. But all I can tell you is he didn't pay a $500,000 judgment, and he got away with it.
And I guess the big thing about this Dark Side of the Ring documentary, the kind of so-called new evidence that came out, was Tonga Kid alleging that he was in the car with Snuka and Nancy on the way to Allentown. But I understand that upon further research, it doesn't appear that Tonga Kid was even on that show.
Well, I just did a piece at my site, and I actually disagree with that a little bit. I think that the Tonga Kid testimony in Dark Side of the Ring is the best part of that episode. It's certainly the piece of brand new evidence, a brand new angle to the case that nobody knew about. I didn't know about. And I was doing an interview with an Irish podcast called Off the Ball on Wednesday, the day after the Dark Side was airing, and I was saying these things. And one of the hosts, Richie McCormick, stopped me and he said, Dave Meltzer just tweeted that Sammy Fatu was not booked on that set of shows in Allentown. And my reaction to that was, well, Dave Meltzer knows a lot, so maybe I better walk this back a little bit. But when you closely examine what Meltzer said, I don't think it disqualifies Sammy Fatu's statements at all, because Sammy Fatu's first, he was as he says in Dark Side of the Ring, he was a troublemaker. He had problems with the law as a juvenile in San Francisco. His mom ships him off to Pennsylvania to train as a pro wrestler under her brothers, Sammy's uncles, Alpha and Sika, the Wild Samoans. So he's there. He's a teenager. His first show is a house show in Connecticut on May 2nd, 1983. Excuse me, May 2nd, 1983, which is a little more than a week before the Snuka Nancy incident. And he's not on the shows in Allentown. But that doesn't mean that he's not hanging around. Snuka is kind of his mentor. He's a fellow Pacific Islander. He's taken him under his wing. Maybe he's driving into Allentown with Nancy and Snuka. That's what he said. It's pretty clear in the post Dark Side of the Ring interviews that by the producers, Jason and Evan, that they didn't ambush Fatu. They got him to clearly contextualize this. They made sure he knew what he was saying. He may not have known the implications of what he was saying in terms of Snuka's alibi, but he was very clear that it was that May 10th taping that he was driving in with Jimmy and Nancy, and that there was no incident of stopping by the side of the road to pee. I think that's very important. I don't think it's a slam dunk. He's a retired pro wrestler. He could be confused, or he could be BSing or trying to get into the spotlight again or something. That is possible. But I don't think just because he wasn't booked on those shows invalidates what he said. He clearly was part of the WWE troupe or family, or at least a hanger-on. He was starting to get prelim bookings. He was training. I don't see any reason to disbelieve that he was driving in the car with Nancy and Jimmy, if that's what he says. And if it's true, then wow, that's another nail in the coffin in terms of Snuka's ridiculous story. Now, on the Dark Side of the Ring, immediately after Sammy Fatu, they have on the retired police chief of Whitehall Township, Frederick Conjure, who makes a complete idiot out of himself, first of all, because he says, well, just because Snuka told a bunch of different stories, it doesn't mean that we can do anything about it. I mean, it's kind of criminology 101 that when you have a circumstantial case with compelling evidence, the fact that the only suspect can't keep a story straight it's got to make you go more aggressively toward finding things out, not just dropping it. So he comes off like a fool, chief conjuror. But significantly, and it turns out that in real time, the interview with Conjuror was immediately after the interview with Fatu. The Dark Side of the Ring interviewers asked him about a story of a third person in the car with Jimmy and Nancy. And Conjuror says, yeah, I might have heard something, a little bit, something about that, which is like another, like, why wasn't it in the reports at the time? The conduct of the police is just unconscionably incompetent at best, but I think much more than that, corrupt. Because even if you accept Snuka's story, why didn't they drive him around to find the exact location where this supposedly happened? They never did that. They did, however, Detective Procanon and another Whitehall officer did go to the trouble of driving 100 miles to the Argentino family's home in Flatbush, Brooklyn, to say, we don't think we've got anything here. And, maybe Nancy had a congenital condition that made her susceptible, if she had a little bump on the head, for it to get really bad and for it to kill her. They didn't present any clinical or scientific evidence to back that up. They just kind of blew off the family. So just on so many levels, everything that the cops and the prosecutors said in Pennsylvania at the time, and I think to this day, is just ridiculous and should be the real focus of public attention.
Because there was more marks on her too than just the bump on the head, from what I understand. And also, wasn't there a history of abuse between those two from just a week or two earlier?
Absolutely. Just 2 months earlier, there was a domestic violence incident at a motel just outside of Syracuse, New York, that actually in the wrestling community got a lot more attention at the time than Nancy's death itself. A couple of months later, it was covered by the mainstream media because it was such a wacky scene with Snuka dragging Nancy down the hallway of this Howard Johnson's, both of them naked. He was dragging her by the hair. It took, I forget how many cops and police dogs to subdue Snuka, who ultimately pleaded down to a minor charge and made a donation to the local Ronald McDonald House, and things just carried on. So there's a history of domestic violence in the Snuka Nancy relationship. There later was domestic violence in Snuka's home with his wife at the time, who were living just down the block on Coles Mill Road in Haddonfield, New Jersey, from Buddy Rogers. The wives were good friends. Buddy Rogers told me in 1992 that Jimmy was a sweet guy, but when he was on junk, cocaine especially, but other drugs as well, that he was totally out of control, and that he used to beat the shit out of his wife. So we have the domestic violence, we have the history of domestic violence with Nancy and Snuka, and we have the markings on Nancy's body when she died, not just the crack in her head, but bruises and signs of trauma throughout her body, which were, as the forensic pathologist said, consistent with maid abuse. So what the hell's going on here?
Was that wife the same wife that appeared in the Dark Side of the Ring episode that was beaten and supposedly complained to Buddy Rogers?
No, Carol Snuka, the widow who's in the Dark Side of the Ring episode, was his last wife, and I'm blanking on the name of his wife at the time in the Carolinas, and then in New Jersey, and mother of at least some of his children. It's a different woman.
So this was Nancy was basically his mistress. He was married. He had 2 lives at the time, right?
Yeah, he was a bigamist. It's not clear whether Nancy knew about his wife, or if she knew about it, and the way women sometimes can be in these situations, had confidence that he was separated, had one foot out the door, and she was his fiance, or we don't really know. But yeah, he was living 2 lives, one at home, one on the road. And on the road, Nancy was not just his girlfriend, but had kind of taken over the Buddy Rogers role of being the person who drove him to his bookings and got him to the church on time. Because Buddy Rogers by then was washing his hands of Snuka because he was worried that Snuka was snorting cocaine in the car while they were driving, and Rogers was worried that he was going to get into serious trouble if he was in the wrong place at the wrong time with Snuka. So Nancy, her sisters say, kind of had a job too. She was Snuka's handler. She got him where he needed to go. He didn't have a driver's license. She did, and she drove him places.
Now, I interviewed Rocky Johnson about this, and he was friends with Snuka, but he even displayed suspicion in my interview with him. But he mentioned to me that at the time all that happened, Snuka actually could have been bigger than Hulk Hogan. So for people that only remember Snuka in the 90s, I guess at that time he was really a massive superstar in the business, which might be why things would have been covered up a little bit.
Completely why. Snuka these are the last years of the old territorial system. Hogan comes to WWF in November or December of 1983, gets an immediate mega push, becomes champion, and the whole Hulkamania, WrestleMania cycle is underway. But prior to Hogan, and even while Bob Backlund was the titular champion of WWF, Snuka was the biggest star. He was box office gold. I mean, he came up from the Carolinas in '79. He was so over. He had freakish athleticism. Nobody sculpted like him, with as thickly muscled as him, had ever been a flyer like he was. And after he did the steel cage splash onto Backlund at the Garden, the reaction was so intense that Vince McMahon Sr., Vincent James McMahon, Vincent Kennedy McMahon's father, who was then running things, realized that they were going to have to flip him from a heel to a baby face because he was so popular. And that started the whole angle with his breakup with Lou Albano. Buddy Rogers brought in as his protector and babyface manager, and he was on fire. And at the time of the Nancy Argentino death, he was at his absolute zenith in the middle of his program with Don Morocco, which culminated. The death of Nancy was May of '83. I want to say October of '83 was the show at the Garden in which Morocco won a controversial cage match, but Snuka splashed him from the top of the cage and left him laying at the end of everything. And he was the superstar of superstars at that moment in WWF history.
What was the fallout he had with McMahon in '85 that made him leave the company for a period of time?
Well, I don't know, but he was becoming increasingly unreliable. Speaking of Sammy Fatu, the Tonga Kid, I mean, he started out as Samoan number 4, but in '84, Snuka did the angle with Roddy Piper on Piper's Pit, where Piper taunts him, hits him over the head with a coconut, causing him to collapse and knock over the whole set of Piper's Pit. And Piper beats him down, and then Jimmy comes to his senses and runs after Piper, but Piper's already made it to the locked door of the dressing room, or however the hell they did that angle. Anyway, that was a really hot angle, and led to main events of Snuka and Piper. But by that point, Snuka was becoming so unreliable about making his shows that they sent him to rehab. I don't know for how long. And that's where Sammy Fatu comes in, actually, because he's a teenager, but he gets this mega push out of nowhere as Jimmy Snuka's cousin from Tonga, the Tonga Kid. And actually, performs pretty well in a tough spot with very little experience. I remember there was a Washington D.C. TV news sports anchor named George Michael who had a syndicated show called the George Michael Sports Machine, and he did a feature on the Tonga Kid. I mean, George Michael was a big mark for the Tonga Kid. Anyway, the point is, Sammy Fight 2, the Tonga Kid was like the Jimmy Snuka surrogate, Superfly 2.0 for that feud, while Jimmy was in rehab and indisposed. So that's one of the things that happened to Snuka in terms of his relationship with WWF, his unreliability. He is in the first WrestleMania, but in a kind of ringside seconding role. He's not performing in the ring. I don't know all the exact chronology, but somehow along the way, he goes down the pecking order. He winds up leaving WWF and going to the AWA. He then goes to the indie circuit. I know he has another run in WWE later, but he's he's in his 40s at that point, and he's probably burning out. But that, yeah, exactly what caused the split with WWF the first time. I don't really know, but he was losing his edge.
And one thing that wasn't covered really in the Dark Side of the Ring, but Tony Atlas mentioned it in an interview with me, as well as his book, is that I guess Johnny Rodz was allegedly the drug dealer to a lot of the guys in those days. His girlfriend at the time was friends with Nancy. That girlfriend, I guess, was considered a bit of a groupie. She ended up marrying Tony Atlas, but Tony has alleged that at one point the two women were in the room together, and that girl could have been a witness. I know Dark Side of the Ring said they tried to find that girl but couldn't. We don't know if she's still alive or not. But have you done any investigation into that part of it at all?
Yeah, like Dark Side of the Ring, I've tried but did not succeed in reaching this woman, and actually others too, like a subsequent a partner of his in the Pacific Northwest, sort of cryptically communicated with the sisters later and said Jimmy told her what had happened. Not anything I could corroborate, and not anything that I published, but yeah, that does seem to be in the ozone somewhere. Now, the Johnny Rodz fiance, I don't know if they got married. The Johnny Rodz girlfriend was like an old friend of Nancy Argentino's from Brooklyn, and was the reason she got backstage at Madison Square Garden and started meeting wrestlers in the early 80s. She actually dated Hulk Hogan for a while before she dated Jimmy Snuka, which is something that not a lot of people know. And I think Hulk was a perfect gentleman in contrast to Snuka. One thing that I really regret about all this stuff that I've written, starting in 1992, was like my first headline over the story was Superfly Snuka and the Death of a Groupie. And no matter how good or bad Nancy Argentino's judgment was and her choices in men, no one deserves to die for it. And I really wish I hadn't used that word groupie, which is kind of a loaded word that re-victimizes victims. So anyway, she was a good friend of Johnny Rodz' girlfriend. That's how she got into meeting wrestlers. And yes, I've heard the Tony Atlas story too. I don't know if it's true or not, but if you held a gun to my head, I'd say it probably is true, but I can't write it because I can't prove it.
And in those days, yeah, we don't want to call them groupies, but there was a group of girls in all the territories that, as I've found out in all the interviews I've done, they would actually rotate around with all the wrestlers, and maybe sometime a wrestler would develop a particular affection and they'd be with them for a while, but it seemed like it wasn't uncommon for some of those girls to be with multiple wrestlers. So that makes sense to me, I guess.
Yeah, that happens. And it's not unique to wrestling, too. Obviously, the other walks of entertainment where performers who are celebrities or minor celebrities, semi-celebrities. There are women and men who attach themselves to them, and to some extent, low-paid performers on the road who are trying to get energized to give their all for their fans day after day after day. Come to think of that sort of attention as a perk of their job.
So, do you think if there was a cover up, it had more to do with a payoff being made because the company wanted to protect Snuka, or was it a case that WWE was coming to Allentown every 3 weeks? It was good for the economy, that the town kind of just wanted to protect themselves a little bit and not stir up any trouble that would possibly prevent WWE from doing these regular shows there.
So you've said two different things: a bribe or a general influence, independence. I'm in the camp 100% the second one. The WWE was the circus that came to town every few weeks. They hired off-duty cops for their security. All the wrestlers hung out at certain spots that did big business. There was revenue and tax receipts from tickets from their shows, and they were a big deal in that corner of Pennsylvania. And it's the reason that I discount the story that first got currency in Snuka's autobiography in 2012, where he vaguely hints at Vince McMahon walking into the climactic meeting with the district attorney carrying a briefcase. And so wrestling fans, being the way they are, immediately extrapolated from that the briefcase was full of cash, and that the cash was a bribe that got distributed to the decision makers, and that's how Snuka got off. Look, that may be what happened, but why would Snuka say that? I mean, his book was ghostwritten. I don't think he wrote a book or maybe even knew what his book said. If you look at Snuka's interviews supporting the book, late 2012 and 2013, you see that he's totally at the mercy of his handlers. When he's asked a question, he sort of answers it how they feed him. So I don't really think, he may not even have known what was in his own book. But to the extent that he did, it may be guilty conscience. It's like every criminal at some level wants to confess, and maybe he was doing that. I think it's likelier that his ghostwriters inserted that in what Alfred Hitchcock used to call a MacGuffin. It's a kind of a nonsensical, non sequitur, irrelevant plot twist that just kind of throws everybody off for a while. And it had the added value of being sensational and gossip friendly, and may have helped the commerce and the sales of Snuka's book when this anecdote got around. That's my theory, but I'm not sticking to it come hell or high water. I just don't think that Vince McMahon had to bribe anybody in Lehigh County, Pennsylvania. I think he was a big deal. And I think that the more I've learned about the way things work in Lehigh County, the more I know that this is like very much in line with the cronyism and corruption of how things happen there. I'm so interested in getting James Martin, the district attorney of Lehigh County, name checked today, because while he's still in office, 30 plus years later, he was the assistant district attorney in '83. While he's still there, he is right now harassing a citizen journalist named Bill Villa, whose daughter Sheena was killed by a drunk driver about 13 or 14 years ago, and has written critically about how Martin didn't prosecute that drunk driver for vehicular homicide as aggressively as Villa believes he should have. And the perpetrator was a well-connected punk son of a prominent lawyer in Allentown. And it's part and parcel with what we see there all the time. And I believe what we saw in the Snuka case. And right now, District Attorney Martin has sued Bill Villa for defamation in an outrageous uh, uh, what's called a SLAPP suit, a strategic lawsuit against public participation, where he's trying to chill the First Amendment rights of a critic of a public official. So once again, Devin, that's why I talk about these things, not just to say redundantly that Jimmy Snuka did it, but to say there are people on the ground there to this day who haven't answered for the justice delayed, justice denied resolution of that case.
Now, you talk about the Ring Boy scandal of the early 90s in your Wrestling Babylon book. I believe there was settlements in those cases from the researches I've done.
Well, I don't want to talk about the announcers so much as the Ring Boys, where the evidence is more compelling. It's a tortured, complicated story because the main accuser, a guy named Tom Cole, has flipped so many times on this. He was an accuser. He settled with them on the eve of shooting a Phil Donahue show. That was a talk show of the period where they had a bunch of people on talking about the scandals that were in the air then. And if Tom Cole had come forward then, it could have been very devastating for the company. But they bought him off, and he actually went to work for WWF. Then he got fired at some point later, and he flipped again and was accusing again. Then when I was writing about it during Linda McMahon's first Senate race in Connecticut in 2010, when my book on Benoit and all the things that I'd written about WWF became a big part of the oppo research for Linda McMahon's, both her primary opponents and her general election opponent, who became the now Senator Richard Blumenthal. During that period, Tom Cole flipped again and said he liked the McMahons and they treated him well. So, who knows? But you've got the stories about others, not Tom Cole, driving fancy cars after that period that they had been given. And we have a number of other holes and other stories of ring boys. Certainly Mel Phillips was a very, very bad guy who kept a black book of ring boys that he contacted on tour, who helped tear down and set up the ring and do other gopher tasks on the WWF tour. And these boys all came from broken, and they were boys exclusively, all came from broken homes. And it's a pattern that those of us, and I've done a lot of sexual abuse, awful stories in settings other than WWE, primarily in USA Swimming and other youth sports where there's a terrible problem of coach sexual abuse. The predators prey on vulnerable kids, and Mel Phillips fit that pattern to a T, and he was a very bad guy. And certainly Terry Garvin sexually harassed Tom Cole. I think the facts that I've written about make that very clear too. No matter how many times Tom Cole himself has gone back and forth and things that he said on the record at various points.
Now, Bruno Sammartino was very publicly against WWE during that time, right up until just before they inducted him in the Hall of Fame. Did you ever find out how much they ended up paying Bruno to kind of get him back on their side?
Yeah, I don't know. And it's, and I wrote very critically of Bruno at the time in a piece that was published at Slam. I was very disappointed because he was a person who represented integrity in a lot of ways to a lot of people. And look, I understand Bruno was an old man. His legacy was at stake. An industry that once consisted of a lot of different players was really down to one major one at that point who controlled, history is told by the winners. And he was worried that everything he'd done was going to get buried if he didn't come to some kind of an accommodation with them. And I don't really even begrudge Bruno a business decision along those lines if he thought that was in his interest. What I couldn't take was Bruno getting on interviews after he was back in the fold with WWE, saying he had carefully vetted the wellness policy, and he had great faith in Dr. Joe Maroon, the medical director of WWE, who had done neurological surgery on Bruno late in his life that was very beneficial to him. I mean, nobody's saying Joe Maroon isn't a good neurosurgeon, but unfortunately, Bruno, what he was saying wasn't true. The wellness policy is a joke. He would never have been saying those kinds of things if he wasn't, back inside the tent again. And it's just very unfortunate. I said what I had to say about Bruno, and we'll leave it at that. He's gone. God rest his soul. He was a great figure in wrestling history.
So the way the wellness policy works now, from what I understand, I guess, as we mentioned before, if someone has a prescription for testosterone, they can take it. I don't know if human growth hormone is tested for or not. And I guess the part-time wrestlers can have different contracts that might allow exceptions to the policy, from what I understand.
I haven't studied the wellness policy in a number of years since I was doing the Benoit book. And look, I will acknowledge that the WWE Wellness Policy is a vast improvement from the nothing that existed prior to the wellness policy. To the extent it deters the worst abuses and may even have saved some lives, credit to them. The point I would make is not just the therapeutic use exemption loophole and other loopholes that they probably, I know they had when I was studying it, may still have to some extent. But I think the basic thing that your viewers need to understand is that it is not transparent. The same company that has the wellness policy has a lab that does contracts to do tests for them, but the lab is not empowered to make decisions about the output of their tests. The decisions are all made by Vince McMahon and Vince McMahon only. And so we know that a wrestler at a certain position in the pecking order is going to be treated in a way that enhancement talent is not treated, or somebody in the middle is not treated. And look, Major League Baseball, the NFL, they don't have perfectly transparent and great drug programs either. They have problems, but they've moved a lot farther in the direction of true transparency and accountability than WWE has. WWE has moved part of the way there. I'll give them that.
It's safe to say that when they bring The Rock back, he's not undergoing the same test as someone like me if I got signed.
Yeah, that's that. I actually used that example in my introduction to the Ultimate Historical Edition of Chris and Nancy. I said, when The Rock parachuted in for looking the way he does in his 40s, I think we can be fairly confident he wasn't asked to pee into a cup. Another example I use, and I hate to go the innuendo route, but John Cena lost time to a torn pec, and pectorals and tricep tears. I mean, there's a whole family of orthopedic injuries that were not in the sports medicine literature prior to the steroid era. So it's like there's using steroids, there's abusing steroids, there's abusing it so badly that you even can't avoid the the signs the signposts that are set up in the wellness policy to avoid. And I'm not ready to say that everybody who has never been suspended for a violation of the wellness policy has never abused steroids. It would be way too naive to say that, and it would not reflect the world that we know we live in.
And you have your Concussions Inc. website. What was your thoughts on the whole WWE concussions lawsuit that I believe is no longer active?
Well, I didn't think much of the lawsuit, and I didn't think much of the lawyer. And I said this at the time. This is not 2020 stuff, because that lawyer was flattering me, was trying to act like we were tag team partners, and wanted me to get involved in publicizing his lawsuits. And I thought the legal work and the fact patterns that he had were kind of shoddy after the fact. And I was not a supporter of that tort regimen that particular lawyer was promoting and advancing. But I do think that the activity, the sport, is intrinsically full of pitfalls in the area of traumatic brain injury, and needs to be looked at closely by government regulators, and it's not. And there's a tremendous, the problem with it isn't just the wrestlers and their families, but it's as in the world of football, where the problem is worse because there's so many more people and it's so widespread. It's, to me, a public health issue. um, it's like, it's not about just the handful of people at the very top who have made a professional decision that they want to be part of Bread and Circus America's gladiator class, take tremendous risks, get tremendous fame and fortune, and possibly shorten their lives or dramatically, harm their quality of life. For a professional adult, that's okay at a certain level. It's not the choice that I would make, but people do make choices. The problem is the social pressure of non-consenting non-adults who aren't fully informed, who get into these things because they have dreams of glory, and a very tiny percentage of people make it to the top of these professions. And again, to segue from wrestling to football, we have like millions of kids as young as age 5 participating at the Pop Warner and junior football levels of this sport, who are unaware, are incapable of deciding for themselves whether to do this. And we have a tremendous strain on our healthcare system. And we have not only brain injuries, but orthopedic injuries and internal organ injuries, and a huge public health tab just for the entertainment and divertissement of the masses. And I think it's messed up.
Also, now that MMA is becoming more popular, and it's actually more popular with kids now than wrestling, from what I understand, they're allowing kids to like do MMA sparring at a younger age. And I think that could add up with concussions as well if you're taking those kind of blows from like grade school on.
Yeah, totally sick stuff. I think it's awful. I mean, the good news is it's happening from my standpoint. The good news is that parents are starting to vote with their feet in high school programs and little league, football programs, and the enrollments, the numbers are going down much too slowly from my perspective, but the trends at least are good there. The problem is, I think we're going to reach a point, and we're getting there pretty fast, where we have a gladiator class. We have people, African American men and other people in tough economic straits, who see this as their only path to prosperity and success in our society. And here we are. It's bread and circus time.
And last thing for the concussion lawsuit, are you surprised that the first guy from that lawsuit WWE hired back was Sylvain Grenier, who is a close friend of Pat Patterson, but probably one of the lowest guys um, in that lawsuit of all the guys that were involved, guys like Road Warrior Animal and Demolition.
That's rich. I hadn't analyzed the roster of plaintiffs with your care and diligence, but that's pretty funny. I mean, you could, in this area as in many others. I mean, you could draw like a Venn diagram or charts of how different people, irrespective of their actual talent, manage to worm their way into the system at higher levels uh, than we would think, but for their connections to particular, high figures in the organization. That's the politics of sports and the politics of show business, which I know Devin did you very wrong, particularly in your own career. But uh, I'm sorry to be so philosophical about it, but that seems to be the way it goes. Yeah, pretty funny story, the example you gave.
I'm better off doing this for a living anyways. It's a lot easier on the brain, as you mentioned.
Yeah, here. And doing a
So
great
where
job, as I must say, this is a really good conversation.
so where can people follow you? I'm going to put your book links in the description of these videos, but if people want to follow you on social media, where can they look you up?
Yeah, so my website is concussioninc.net, concussioninc.net. I am at Irv Much, IRVMUCH, on Twitter, which is, at my advanced age, about the only social media platform that I can really handle. I have a Facebook account too, but I don't do anything with it. It just reruns my Twitter timeline. And of my books, which I'm very proud. I want your viewers to know about the new edition, the Ultimate Historical Edition of Chris and Nancy, the uh, uh, the story of the Benoit murder suicide, and that's available in ebook form only at this point on Kindle, Amazon Kindle, and other ebook platforms. But the print version of the new edition will be out at some point in the future. And if you go to my website and you want an autographed copy of the classic edition, you can order that directly from me. Uh, I have the my first book, Wrestling Babylon, which includes the Jimmy Snuka chapter. And because of its relevance now, there's a lot of new attention to my self-published ebook with the Argentino sisters in 2013 called Justice Denied, which expands on my 2007 book chapter about Snuka, has a lot of primary source documents, photos of Nancy and Snuka, and other goodies. So people should consider checking that out as well.
Are there any stories about Sam Mushnick in any of those books?
Well, there's the first chapter of Wrestling Babylon is about being Sam Muchnick's nephew and what it was like to. I start out the book talking about how, where were you? I know you're too young for this, but what were you doing on November 22nd, 1963, hours after President John F. Kennedy was assassinated? Well, I was 9 years old. I'll tell you what I was doing. I was at Kiel Auditorium watching Lou Thez defend the NWA title against Fritz von Erich because my uncle decided that it was too late to cancel the show. All the guys had already flown in. He went ahead and held it. He had Monsignor Louis Meyer, the director of the youth department of the Archdiocese of St. Louis, deliver a eulogy to President Kennedy. They played the national anthem, and then it was on with the show. It was about a two-thirds filled Kiel Auditorium. And I tell that story because 2 days later, the National Football League played their full schedule of games, and poor Commissioner Pete Rozelle got criticized, chastised for his poor taste. But in St. Louis, Sam Muchnick owned the town, and everybody thought it was the classiest thing they'd ever seen. That he had Monsignor Meyer do a prayer before the wrestling show, hours after the president had been assassinated. So those are the kinds of Sam Muchnick stories I like to tell. Sam Muchnick was a very honest businessman. The talent liked him because he paid well. He was as good as his word. Uh, but to me, he was just my uncle, and famous wrestling promoter and somebody who got me into observe this peculiar industry from the time I was knee high to a turnbuckle.
Who was his favorite of all the wrestlers he worked with? There's so many over the years.
Oh, he had a lot of guys. He was a real good friend of Dick the Bruiser's. He he and Fritz were very close, which made it difficult when I then wrote one of my first big magazine articles for Penthouse magazine, which is also collected in Wrestling Babylon. My book, my article about the Von Erich wrestling family.
I saw your interview on that. Actually, there's a YouTube interview back from 1988. You had
Oh,
more
that
hair.
one, yeah, that one on some talk show that when Joan Rivers' talk show collapsed. Yeah, it wasn't much of an interview. I remember that well because it was like I was flying back and forth from Berkeley, California to Los Angeles while my wife was about to give birth to our first child, like a day or two later. Yeah, yeah, that was well. But so speaking of Dark Side of the Ring, that's another one they didn't have me on, and I didn't think much of their orientation, but yeah, my uncle, everybody liked him. He was Switzerland. All the promoters knew that he would broker things honestly, and he was he had an unusual background for the wrestling business. He had just been a sports writer and then an assistant to Tom Pax, the wrestling promoter in the 1930s in St. Louis. And he approached wrestling like a sport. And as I said, he had the town of St. Louis in the palm of his hand. They loved him. He could do no wrong.
Now, just you reminded me about the Von Erichs. I forgot to ask you about that. Some people said they thought Fritz could have been abusive to the boys. What's your theory on that?
Well, I don't know. I guess so. I mean, I don't think that the boys themselves would, by a classic definition of abuse, would deny that. I mean, he had physical punishment and discipline of them. I don't think that's the guts of the Von Erich story. The guts of the Von Erich story was that he was this hypocritical, Bible beating, wrestling evangelical. Essentially, he was the Elmer Gantry of wrestling, or the Jim Baker or Jimmy Swaggart of wrestling, who had this like all American image and his all American boys, and it was all about telling the angles and fictions of wrestling in a way advantageous to his family. And we all know the story of all the deaths of all those kids. It's just uh, Dave Meltzer said in a quote from my article at the time, which was 1988, I believe. He said, uh, uh, wrestling has its oddities, and I can swallow just about everything about it except the Von Erichs. It just goes too far. I don't think that's the way Dark Side of the Ring saw it, but that's the way I see it.
Kevin seems to be pretty well off these days. Do you think that's from inheritance?
I don't know. I mean, good for Kevin. He's the last one standing. He's a survivor, and if his sons are enjoying themselves in the industry, more power to them. It's I can't buy his line about Fritz being a great man, and I know it's his father, and he feels like he wants to say that, and he probably believes it. But I see it as more, and I said this in a review I wrote of the Dark Side of the Ring piece last year that's on the Concussion Inc. website. I think it's sort of like The Great Santini, if you've ever seen that movie with Robert Duvall. It's the military, a self-delusional figure who kind of terrorizes everyone in the family to buy his hype and his narrative and his glory. And it's kind of, if you take a step back from it, it's really not true. But again, good for Kevin if he's happy in Hawaii in his late life and he's come to peace with all these things. I'm not here to attack Kevin Von Erich.
Well, thanks a lot for being so generous with your time. I've read a lot of your articles over the years, so it's a pleasure to hear some of these stories firsthand. Is there anything you'd like to say to close this up?
No, just that it was awesome, Devin. I really appreciate it. I hope your viewers enjoy our chat.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV. Please like this video if you enjoyed it and click the subscribe button to not miss any of our latest shoot interviews, match videos, or news updates. Support us on patreon.com for $1.99 a month to watch our full shoot interviews ad-free and help our channel grow. Follow us on Twitter at the Hannibal TV for instant updates.